Okay, good evening. I'm just trying to finish up with our chapter 16 so that we can get to our activity tomorrow. So I'm going to finish out the lesson. Should only take 10, 15 minutes, but let's get going. So today in class we talked about industrialization and the industrialists that were there. We also talked about maybe some of the issues that we had with industrialization, the trust that were created, the fact that they were created because or with the result of not having true market economy, essentially able to set prices, able to not have the invisible hand of the market, invisible hand of consumers set prices. Instead, they were able to set prices. Not to mention, we looked at maybe how good and some of the bad things that they did as well. So let's look at some of the impacts that we had as a result of industrialization. The thing about industrialization, it essentially raised the overall standard of living for most people in America. Not the bottom part, but the majority of people. It expanded the middle class. We actually created middle management positions. So you have the CEOs, then you have the upper management, and then typically before you had the workers. Now we created middle management. Managers that were being managed, but also managers that were managing workers. And most of these went to white native-born Americans, which one of the impacts of immigration is that it elevated some, previous lower-level workers. It also created the need for accountants and clerical workers, also increased the need for sales. We obviously have marketing departments that are going to be a bigger deal in the 20th century and maybe even later on in the 20th century. The number of good paying jobs increased. And so the overall standard of living did increase. That's why we call this the Gilded Age. And we'll talk about what gilded means later on. But for the most part, the standard of living did increase. However, it did create this division between rich and poor. 90% of the nation's wealth were held by 10% of the individuals, which is a big contrast. When 90% of the nation's wealth is controlled by 10, they control the nation, essentially. 90% of the wealth is controlled by a very few amount of people. It also created the Alger myth. Horatio Alger created this idea that rags to riches stories, self-made men, that if you just work hard, you can be wealthy as well. And just in reality, that's not true. Because if that were true, there'd be way more millionaires and way more billionaires if it just related to working hard. And so this myth created this need for people to work 60, 70, 80, 90-hour weeks because they thought if they just work harder, then they can become rich. And honestly, a lot of these industrialists took advantage of that. Took advantage of this idea that they can be rich just by working hard, and so they worked them hard. And so it was beneficial for them. However, wages stayed stagnant. Very few people did see the fruits of that labor. And so, as you can see from this graph on the right, the overwhelming majority of people were in the poorer class that earned very, very little. The other impact is that we did create a group of wage earners, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in itself. 2/3 of Americans worked for hourly wages that required 10-hour days, 60-hour weeks. And so you have a lot of people that are working for money and not getting paid overtime for that. With, again, the idea that if they just work harder, they'll make more money, which, yes, if you work more in wages, you will make more money. However, they kept wages low. Competition, the fact that we had an overabundance of workers, immigrants coming in that are willing to work for some of those lower wages are going to keep wages low. honestly barely above the level to survive. I mean, 60-hour weeks and barely able to survive on single income rely or created this need or reliance on women and children entering the workforce as well. David Ricardo's iron law of wages was used to justify those low factory wages. The belief is that just raising wages would attract more workers, increasing the supply of workers, and that increase in supply of workers would cause wages to fall even lower than they were before. So his argument for uh, raising wages is that it's going to cause competition, which then the market would lower wages even lower than they were today. Not sure how you come up with that math. Not sure if that's big brain math or not. I mean, I'm no math lead or not, but not sure if that computes. So knowing with all of this, with the fact that we have low wages, the fact that we are earning wages, the fact that we have concentration of wealth, is it appropriate to consider these people captains of industry or robber barons? And you guys already did your LEQ on that with your contextualization and thesis. And it's up to you. I mean, they are both. We all know that they are both. And robber baron simply is a person who has become rich through ruthless and unethical business practices. And some of those business practices are exploiting workers through pay, terrible hours, terrible working conditions. Most of them didn't care about customers. They purposely kept prices high. They bought out competitors just so they wouldn't have competition, because we know what drives markets is competition. People like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Hill, Astor, those are all robber barons and captains of industry at the same time. It just depends on which one you think that they are more of. We're not going to watch this. Great one to watch, however. Other impacts is labor discontent. People started working in factories that were terrible. Before industrialization, artisans or skilled craftsmen would create a product from start to finish. Now we have factory workers. Now we have mechanized work, and people did one thing in this machine, and it was very monotonous. Working conditions were terrible. They used chemicals and pollutants. They did not have ventilation for the machines that they were using. And so how do workers then get any rights? When you don't have the power, when you don't have the money, and if me as an individual went to my boss and said, hey, I need a raise or else, I can guarantee you the or else is going to supersede the higher wages. They'll just find another worker for me. So they need to organize. And so we're now talking about organized labor. And organized labor is simply unions. It is people, groups of people that get together. Instead of individually coming up and asking for wages, asking for better working conditions, you do it as a group. You do it collectively. And this is what organized labor is. And obviously unions have a kind of can have a negative connotation, but also can have a positive connotation. Just depends on what you're looking at. So management obviously held most of the power, as we said. And what device can you use as a union to maybe get what you want? Well, one of those things is going to be striking. Striking is simply where you refuse to work, or you refuse to do the work. You come to work but refuse to do the work, or you block the entrance to it and stand outside. You picket. There's a lot of ways that you can strike. And so one way is the management beat those striking are through these methods. One is scabs. Scabs are simply strikebreakers, people that they hire in place. Oftentimes, this is going to be African Americans. Oftentimes, African Americans were used as scabs. They were obviously the group in the turn of the century that are going to have the least employment and most unemployment. And so they're going to use African Americans as strikebreakers. I myself was a scab at one point. The company I worked for in Vermilion, we took calls for them. We were not part of them. We were a third party. And so when their employees, their customer service employees went on strike, they asked us to take on more calls. And so we did. And we actually had people come to Vermilion from Texas and picket our are building in Vermilion, South Dakota, calling us scabs. So that's what scabs are, simply strike breakers, people that they hire in place. Either that or they'll lock out the factory, because not everybody in the factory oftentimes striked, went on strike. And so they would close the factory for any other workers, which would make them upset and hopefully get them to stop the strike. They could also blacklist. We see union workers. If you were a part of a union, you could be on a blacklist and no one would hire you. Also, a lot of businesses decided to create yellow dog contracts. And yellow dog contracts are simply those agreements that you would sign that promises you would not join a union. Another method used, and we'll see this here in a second, is calling the government. Calling the government and have the state militia or private guards come and force them into some of these jobs, stop them striking, force them to work, or get them out of the way for scabs. The other option is court injunctions. Court injunction is simply the court stops a strike. The court strikes down your strike and says you have to work. This created this public fear of unions, and one of the reasons why there's a fear of unions is because they became violent. We'll talk about some of those violent tactics. Not all their fault, but they're the ones being blamed for it. Unions decide to nationalize. So we have a teachers union. There's a nurses union. There's a doctors union. There's a rail workers union. There's a mechanics union. There's a Starbucks union. There's unions that are specific to the job that they have. And then there are national unions. National unions are just those that try to organize all unions underneath it. It's umbrella. Everything underneath the umbrella are those individual unions. The first attempt was National Labor Union, and that started in 1866. And they just tried to organize both skilled and unskilled. In 2 years, they had 640,000 members. Their goal was 8-hour day and higher wages. They did achieve the 8-hour workday for federal government employees, but not all employees. They also talked about some social movements, such as equal rights for women and African Americans, God forbid, monetary reforms, and worker-owned co-ops. So that means workers would get some of the profits rather than just always going to that. However, 1877, they had some NLU strikes, and some of those strikes became violent, and because of yellow dog contracts and because of other things, many people just lost interest. The second one was the Knights of Labor, and that's going to be your biggest one. That's kind of the largest union. It began as a secret society because of the contempt for unions in 1869. And they tried to open up membership to all workers, including African Americans and women. However, and it was successful. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was successful. It peaked at 730,000 members in 1886. However, the Haymarket bombing, the Haymarket riot in Haymarket Square, where 7 police officers were killed when a bomb was thrown. 8 anarchists were tried and sentenced to death as a result of it. They were called anarchists, which in some ways they were. But again, this is just creates this idea in people's minds that unions are radical and violent. And so they went away. They're still around today, but they went away for a good half century. Finally, the largest and most successful is going to be the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. Again, still around today. They're the most successful of the early unions, because we're going to see this early union movement, and then it's going to go away, and then we're going to see the union movement come back again later on. But this one sticks around. This is led by Samuel Gompers, and Samuel Gompers would be on, if we look at union leaders, he's going to be on the Mount Rushmore. So Samuel Gompers, they focused more on realistic goals. Unfortunately, they did not include women. They did not include African Americans. They did not include child labor laws. They realized that these were not very realistic at the time. Again, they simply worked for higher wages and better working conditions. They had the 8-8-8, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for doing whatever you want. So 8-hour work days is what they really focused on. Over 1 million members by 1901. However, most of these early labor unions do not see a lot of successes. until earlier in the 1900s. So a couple examples of strikes: the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This was a strike on railroads where railroad companies cut wages because of the economic depression that was going on in 1877. Because they wanted to reduce costs, they cut wages. Rail workers went on strike, and the strike ended up shutting down 2/3 of the country's railroad tracks. The strike on B&O Railroad specifically spanned 11 states. 500,000 other workers joined the strike, and that includes any industries that would help out the railroad industry. So steel industry, people in the steel industry went on strike. People in the rail car industry went on strike. President Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, sent in troops in 1877. So he obviously is on the side of the big businesses, and he shut it down. Over 100 people were killed as a result of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Again, just showing how violent that unions are, and creating this discontent with people. Second one is Homestead Strike that we're going to talk about, and that is in Carnegie Steel. Again, they cut wages by about 20% because of the depression that was going on. So the workers then called for a strike. And the head of the plant, Henry Clay Frick, yes, Henry Clay, not that Henry Clay, guy named after Henry Clay, but Henry Clay Frick, who was a manager of the plant, decided to cut wages. And when they went on strike, he first tried to use lockouts. Then he called a private detective agency, a private militia group, essentially, called the Pinkertons, to protect non-union workers, the ones that were still working. And when that got violent, he called in scabs, African Americans, to do so. And then it became violent. It became violent when shots were fired, and the Pinkertons were able to defeat the people after the governor of Pennsylvania decided to send 8,000 National Guard troops into Homestead to back up the Pinkertons. So eventually they had to surrender. And it honestly set the union movement back decades. And it won't be until the Great Depression where they actually get some stuff. And finally, the last straw, if you will, is a Pullman strike. And the Pullman strike was the Pullman factory cars. They would make sleeper cars for the wealthy. So if you've ever been on a train, they have sleeper cars and they have regular cars. Sleeper cars were ones that were pretty elegant, especially the ones that were for the wealthy. But what they created was this factory town. They created a factory and then almost a town around it, where the people that worked in Pullman factory lived in Pullman, in factory apartments. They had factory grocery stores. They had factory movie theaters. They had factory everything, and they essentially had to spend their money there. Well, when he cut wages by 25%, he didn't reduce rent or reduce prices in his company town, in the Pullman town, and so they were making way less and getting hurt as a result of that. And so the ARU, the American Railway Union, decided to come in on the strike. And since the ARU handled all railroad work, they promised to not do any work. They would not touch any cars that had a Pullman car attached to it. And so anytime there was a Pullman car attached to it, rail workers would not do that. And so it essentially created this shutdown of America. President Cleveland what they decided to do was attach mail cars, federal mail cars, to Pullman cars in order for this to be more of a national issue. And so since it's a federal issue, President Cleveland called in federal troops to break up the union and to force them to work on cars that had mail in it. And essentially, the Supreme Court approved it, the federal government approved it, the states approved it, The local governments approved it. So all these government entities are now on the side of big businesses. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that government is on the side of big business and not the little guy, not the workers, not the people. When we get to the progressive era, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see the issues that were as a result of this come to fruition. All right, I highly recommend you watching both of the Heinler videos that I posted in Canvas and also answer the question that goes along with this.